My name is Josephine Jones, and I direct programs in the Center for the Book for Colorado Humanities. I just have to say that last night in this very room, my 6-year-old granddaughter and I were sitting in leopard-colored covered chairs telling each other scary stories. And I told her tonight I get to do it with adults in the very same room. So thank you so much for joining us from your living room. Everything we do at Colorado Humanities is a team effort, and I would particularly like to recognize Chris Goff for taking the lead on moving these readings online, and to thank her and Tanya Albright, who appears as Colorado Humanity there, who's co-hosting behind the scenes here for technical support, as well as our board of directors and the army of volunteers who selected the finalist books. I would like to let you know how I hope this will go. We ask finalists and speakers to mute their microphones unless they're the one talking or the one asking a question. That will help all of us hear better. For attendees, your microphones are currently muted. We invite you to introduce yourself and let us know you're here by typing your name and any contact information you'd like to share in the chat. If you have a question for the author, you'll need to type it in the chat feature. The Q&A didn't work quite right last time. Although we are online this year, instead of snug in the book bar with a treat and a beverage, I have mine here nearby. I hope you do too. We can still purchase books through the book bar's website. The book bar is our co-host for the readings and will gladly mail them. Now our sponsors continue their support. Denver-based Outskirts Press, a longtime sponsor of the Colorado Center for the Book, stands ready to help authors develop, publish, and market their books. And Colorado Sun is also providing funding and is featuring weekly Sun-led excerpts and interviews from many of our Colorado authors' books. And I know Carter has been one of their monthly or book club featured authors too, right, Carter? So they're just doing wonderful things, I think, for Colorado authors. We want to thank them, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and all of you for being here. If you'll indulge me and do a hashtag CO Humanities at Home, that will join the national effort to provide humanities programming at home right now, and hashtag CBA 2020 to gather all the Colorado Book Awards events as we post about our experiences with the finalists and their work. I am particularly delighted to welcome Chris Goff as our MC. Chris is not only the Colorado Book Awards program coordinator, but the author of 8 novels, 2, Chris, Riza Jordan novels, both of which were Colorado Book Award finalists in the thriller category, and 6 in the Birdwatchers Mystery Series, which has just been re-released by Sharp Books. Chris Goff, thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. It's my pleasure to introduce you to 6 talented writers whose books have been named by Colorado Book Awards selectors as the finalists in the mystery and thriller categories. The finalists from the mystery category will start, followed by finalists in the thriller category. We'll try and move quickly. We have plenty of time for questions and answers. We have a lot of people in the attendees. I saw a few names I recognized. Terry Wolf, I want to say hi to you. I'm so glad you're here. And our first reader tonight is running a little late, so we're going to skip over him and come back. And we're going to move to the next reader, which is Emily Littlejohn. She'll be reading from her novel, Lost Lake. Emily was born and raised in Southern California. She's a former librarian. In addition to writing, she's raising a family and working in city government in the Denver metro area. Her acclaimed debut novel, Inherit the Bones, was followed by her second, A Season to Lie. Emily?
Thank you, Chris. How's my sound? Am I good? All right.
You're good.
Just good. Nice to see everybody tonight. Well, first of all, tremendous thank you to the Colorado Humanities and the Center for the Book, as well as the Book Bar and Outskirts Press for hosting tonight's event. This is truly such an honor to be here next to such talented authors that I have tremendous respect for. Dirk and Clive Cussler, Margaret Mizushima. Hi, Margaret, I see you there at the top of the screen. Hi. As well as our thriller finalists in addition. So I write the Gemma Monroe mystery series, and Gemma is a detective in the very small fictional town of Cedar Valley, Colorado. It's sort of a combination of Crested Butte, Breckenridge, a little bit of Boulder, a little bit of Estes Park. Just picture all your fantasy small Colorado towns and put them all together, and that's what Cedar Valley is in my mind. And the way that I've described it in the past is it's sort of like this beautiful wedding cake with all of these layers and flowers and Victorian architecture, and then underneath it's like a cemetery of secrets and plot twists and darkness. And that's how my stories unroll. So they all feature the same characters in the same small town. But much like the Jessica Fletcher stories, there's always a fresh body in every mystery. And so that's not a place that you'd want to spend a lot of time in, because with it being a small population, that population is dwindling quite a bit. So Gemma is a detective. She's been a detective about 5 or 6 years in town, and she has a toddler daughter and a very arrogant yet lovable partner at work, Finn. And then she has a fiance too, who we sort of love to hate and hate to love. And he weaves in and out of the books as sort of this will they, won't they, that kind of a relationship. So Lost Lake is the 3rd book in the series, and the novel opens with Gemma being called out on a missing persons report. A young woman, Sari Chesney, has been camping with 3 friends at the very remote site. It's a high alpine lake. And this is May, so there's still snow on the ground, and it's kind of an unusual place for people to be camping. But Gemma is called because overnight, Sari has seemingly vanished from sight. So the investigation heats up rather quickly when Sari's boss then turns up murdered, and a priceless diary also then disappears. And of course, this being Cedar Valley, as the modern day investigation continues, all sorts of other secrets start bubbling to the surface there as well. So I'm going to stop there because saying anything more would start to give too much away. Okay. And then the selection that I'm reading from is the very brief prologue, because I think it sets a good tone for understanding how the rest of the book is going to flow. All right. So this is the prologue, Lost Lake. Something wakes her in the early hours. Beyond the flimsy nylon walls of the tent, it is still dark. They went to bed after midnight, so she guesses it is 4 or 5 in the morning. The sun will rise soon, and with it another day, another breakfast, another hike, another lunch, another fight. She listens and realizes the sounds of the lake have changed. Gone is the gentle wind moving through the trees. The bullfrog has stopped its belligerent croak. The ice, cracking against the shore, has settled down. It was the silence that woke her. She sits up slowly, careful not to disturb Mac. He lies on his back, one hand resting on his stomach, the other hidden in the depths of his sleeping bag. Mac looks like a little boy in sleep, his lips slightly parted, the faintest scowl line across his strong brow. She hopes he is having a nightmare. Then she feels bad and wonders if the baby will have his strong brow, his red hair. She wonders if she cares. She gently untangles herself from the sleeping bag and then from the tent. Slipping on her boots, leaving them untied, she stands, stretching, scanning the campsite by the little light that remains of the waning moon. She stares for a moment at the red tent pitched 15 feet away on the opposite side of the still smoldering campfire pit. The 2 people inside the red tent were strangers yesterday, and she wonders if the wine and the weed and the close quarters of the night have left them better acquainted. Nothing would surprise her anymore. She walks to the edge of the campsite and stares down at the dark, still water, not daring to go any closer. Lost Lake. The air is freezing and she shivers. She hugs herself and looks at the far shoreline. There was a campfire last night across the water. She is sure of it. She saw the smoke. She wonders who else is here. Who else is mad enough to spend the night on the still frozen ground along the shores of this icy lake? She moves slowly, heading back towards the warmth of her sleeping bag. The silence remains. And I'll stop there.
Very good.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? If you have some questions, type them into the chat. And I, at this moment, don't see any. And if you would, if anybody here has some questions, or you have a question, Carter?
Hey, Emily.
Hi, Carter. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for your reading. I want to know, as far as your series goes, since I don't write series, I'm always curious, like how difficult was this book to write relative to some of your others within the same series?
That's a great question, Carter. So this one was actually probably the easiest to write. This was the third book in the series. The first one, as you know, having written more than a handful of books yourselves, the first one is gravy. The first one is easy. There's no pressure, no expectations. You don't think anybody's going to read it. You can spend all the time in the world writing it. And you write it and it gets out there. And I was really blessed to have a great reception of that novel. So then with the second one, there's all sorts of pressure, right? Suddenly you're under contract, which is great, but there's a timeline, there's expectations. You now have a reader base that's really interested in what's happened with your characters. So the second, I would say, was the hardest. The third was the easiest. The third, the title, the plot, a lot of it came together pretty quickly for me. And I was able to write it in a way that felt really easy. It didn't feel forced. And then the editing too, which I really enjoy, came together. Thank you for the question.
There's a question in the chat from Kate, who wants to know how important is setting in your novel. She actually would like, how important?
How important is setting? Yeah, so in this series, particular setting is pretty important because it's a small town, because the population, many of them have been there for many, many years. They're entwined, right? They're like roots under a tree. And so in this series, the town really plays almost as strong a role, a character role, as the actual characters do.
I have a question. Did they make you fictionalize your town?
Did they what?
Make you create a fictionalized town?
That was my decision. That was all my goal. Because I really wanted to populate it with some old crimes, and there were features of it that don't exist in any town in our state that I'm aware of. It's small enough so that most of the folks know each other, but large enough so that there's a pretty robust police force. There's actually 2 hospitals. Once you actually start looking into it, it's definitely more fictional than realistic.
And there's another question about whether you or any of the others think they will need to reference the pandemic in the books going forward.
Oh. Wow, that's a great question. Anybody else want to take that? Probably not in this series for me, but some of the other authors maybe.
Yeah, I'll say just in my next work, which is coming out next year, I had to go back and backdate everything because it was very clearly set in 2020. I had timestamps and it just made no sense. So now it's 2017. So yeah, that's going to be a big consideration for writers going forward, is that this is a big, just as September 11th was.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to let one more question and then we're going to move on and we'll get to more questions after that. Is Gemma based on anyone you know?
You know, she's not. I love that question because I think as authors, that's something that some of us have to be careful of, right? I think some of us put a lot of ourselves in our characters, and some of us have characters that are so far removed from who we would ever be that it's pretty obvious that it's not. She's much braver than I would ever be. She does things like go into dark places with no backup, and where there's a high likelihood that there's a serial killer hiding lurking behind the door, and I wouldn't do things like that. But great question.
So thank you. And now I'm going to back up, and we've got Dirk here. Hi, Dirk. You're going to have to unmute. And let me find my notes. I had them right where I wanted them. And now, of course, I Can't find the one I'm looking for. I'm so sorry. Here it is. Dirk and his father, Clive Cussler, are the authors of 7 previous Dirk Pitt adventures. So we're going to have to hear how he chose to use your name for the hero of his story. But for the past several years, you have been an active participant, partner, and served as board of trustees, president of your father's National Underwater and Marine Agency, in addition to writing. So he will be reading from his mystery novel, Celtic Empire. Go ahead. Oh, we don't have sound. We don't have any sound for you. Try again.
Sound now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Everything worked great in practice, but falling apart tonight. So I'm sorry I got here a little late. I did get here in time to hear Emily's reading, so I know I want to rush out and buy a copy of Lost Lake right away. But again, thank you for having me. My book, Celtic Empire, which I wrote with my father. Let me show the book because I think they did a bang-up job with the artwork on it. One thing to note, I guess, when you've written a couple of dozen books like my father, the name gets to be larger than the title. I'm hoping maybe another 5 or 10 books, maybe my name will get to be as large as the title, but we'll see. But as far as the book goes, this is actually the 25th book in the Dirk Pitt series created by my father many years ago. His first book was actually published in 1973, so the series is pushing 50 years, if you can believe that. And finally, a CBA nomination in the process. This is the 8th book in the series that I have co-written with my father, who, as some of you know, just passed in February. For those not familiar with the series, they are classic adventure tales that blend history, action, intrigue, and occasional romance. Celtic Empire is inspired by an actual legend in Irish history, where an Egyptian princess and her tribe of warriors were said to have conquered Ireland some 3,000 years ago. She was known as Queen Scoda, and her descendants laid claim to northern Britain in later times, which is where Scotland got its name. So we incorporate a hunt for her grave in order to save the world from a deadly scourge and try to have some fun with it along the way. I'd like to read a short chapter from the book. This is a standalone chapter, so it doesn't have any of the main characters, but I think it gives a sense of the plot anyway. Chapter 18, edited for anybody reading along. Manjit Patel heard the sobbing from his wife even before he opened the door to his house. Entering the one-room tenement in the Dharavi slums of Mumbai, he found his wife seated on the floor, rocking a young child in her arms. "What is the matter, Pratima?" The woman looked up, tears on her cheeks. "It is the baby. He has been violently ill all day." Patel examined the child. Just under the age of 2, the boy was hot and limp in his mother's arms. His bulging eyes were dull and listless. Patel touched his son's head and then pinched his arm, noting the skin felt hard and rubbery. "We must take him to the clinic." The weary man, who made his living driving a tuk-tuk in the streets of Mumbai, helped his wife to her feet with child in arms. They exited their tin-roofed house and trudged down a muddy lane littered with trash and reeking of assorted odors. 6 blocks away, they reached a small clinic. Passing through its glass doors, they were aghast to find the waiting room crammed with people, nearly all clutching a baby or toddler in their arms. Patel made his way to the admissions desk. "My son, you'll have to wait," an elderly woman behind the desk cut him off. She waved a hand toward the waiting room. "They are all sick." Patel signed an admittance sheet, then shuffled back to his wife, who had found a spot on the floor. They waited nearly an hour before a young woman in a white coat appeared and began examining the patients in the waiting area. "There's no more space in the examination room," she announced. "Just stay where you are and I'll come to you." The room had swelled to overflowing by the time she reached the Patels. The doctor took their son's pulse, then called to an assistant. An intravenous solution bag was brought over and the doctor injected a line into the boy's arm. Hold this up, she instructed, passing the bag to Patel. The boy, will he be all right, he asked. Yes, I think so. You are lucky. You brought him in when you did. Is it cholera? We are careful with the water. The doctor nodded. Care does not matter in this instance. The entire city seems to be infected, even Bandra, and more lethal than usual. She motioned her eyes toward a woman in a green shawl behind her, then quickly moved on to the next patient. Patel sat with his wife on the floor, keeping the IV bag elevated. As he waited to see signs of improvement in his son, he glanced at the woman in the shawl. She sat across the room, mumbling to herself while rocking an infant in her arms. Patel caught a brief glimpse of the baby and saw with sadness that it was dead. The mother had refused to give it up, however, and sat rocking on the floor for hours. It would not be the last dead child he would witness. A steady stream of parents left the clinic in grief, unable to save their young children from the quick-striking disease. The overworked doctor circled back some time later and removed the empty IV bag. Your son looks better. I'm afraid that is all I can do for you. Take him home and keep him hydrated. Thank you, doctor. Patel steadied his son with relief. His eyes were fully open now, and he seemed to have more strength. Patel just felt it in his bones. His son would be one of the lucky ones. The tuk-tuk driver helped his wife up and stepped to the door. Something had bothered him since he had arrived at the clinic, and he hesitated at the door in search of an answer. He looked around the crowded room, studying the parents and their sick children. It took a moment for him to realize what was wrong, and then it struck him. All of the sick children in the clinic were boys.
Very good, very good. Gosh, now I've got so many books to read. You know, I did not read anybody's books before the contest, before everything was adjudicated. I actually had my bedside table with most of these books, and I've been very good about not doing that. So, so do we have any questions for Dirk? Let me look over here and see. Dirk, from Earl. First, sorry about your loss and your family's loss. Second, you mentioned you hope your name will be as large as the title in future books. Does that mean you plan to continue the Dirk Pitt series?
Yes, at least for the near term. I'm actually nearing completion of one right now, or hoping to have it out in the fall. Working title is The Devil's Sea, so I'm zeroing in on that. But I think Dirk Pitt will continue to live in one fashion or another, I hope, for many years to come.
So I have a question for you. I knew your father, and I know he's like a big treasure hunter. I can remember him sitting at a dinner telling my husband all about the lost train that they found buried in the middle of Kansas or something. And anyway, it was, are you interested in the treasure hunting as well? And do you travel to the places that the books are set in?
Let me answer the first one. Is most definitely. I sort of grew up a lot of that. And generally it wasn't so much treasure. He was always interested in history and historical shipwrecks finally. So yeah, I spent a lot of summers as a youth on a beach somewhere in South Carolina looking for lost Confederate submarines and other shipwrecks. And been trying to continue that. One of the wrecks he always regretted not finding was a John Paul Jones wreck over in the North Sea in England. And I've led a couple of expeditions for that too, and it's one we've never found that we'd still like to go back and search. So hoping to keep that aspect alive. Answer to your second question, you know, it's a funny thing. You have all the resources today to research places, and invariably I find out that I go visit a place after I write about it in the book because it really draws my interest, and then I go visit it afterwards. So I've always had it sort of backward in terms of the writer. I should visit it first, but it always seems to work out the other way around.
There's a question from NM He. Do you foresee ever creating a female character that has adventures like Dirk?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. You know, Pitt has his children too, so he's got a daughter, Summer, who gets involved with some of the adventures. One of the other series that my father created is called The Fargos, and it's sort of a husband and wife team as well. I think it's a great idea. I mean, there's readership is heavier weighted towards women. So I think that's a great idea. We haven't quite got there, but I think it's a great idea.
Good. All right. Well, then we'll move on and we'll have time for more questions at the end. So next up is Margaret. She's the last reader in the mystery category, Margaret Mitsushima, who will read from her mystery novel, Tracking Game. The author of the award-winning and internationally published Timber Creek Canine series, Margaret is active within the writing community. The member of several writers' organizations, she serves as president for the Rocky Mountain chapter of Mystery Writers of America and was elected the 2019-2020 Writer of the Year by Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers. She lives in Colorado on a small ranch with her veterinarian husband, where they raise 2 daughters and a multitude of animals. Margaret?
Thanks, Chris. First of all, I do want to thank Chris, Josephine, Tanya, and anyone else at Colorado Humanities who had a part in putting on this broadcast tonight. We really appreciate your hard work. Thank you also to Book Bar and Outskirts Press for sponsorship. And also thanks to all of you in the audience for coming. We couldn't have a celebration without you, so thank you very much. Tracking Game is actually the 5th. That's backwards on my screen. Okay.
It's right, it's okay.
Okay, good. It's actually the 5th episode in the Timber Creek Canine Mystery Series. And this series features Deputy Maddie Cobb and her canine partner, Robo. They are the only canine unit in Timber Creek County, a fictional county in Colorado. And there's a 3rd protagonist, Cole Walker, who is a veterinarian, and he also serves as Maddie's love interest. Tracking Game kind of starts off with a bang. Maddie and Cole are at a community dance that gets interrupted by an explosion on the west side of town. They rush to the scene where they find a burning van parked at the side of a county road. They also find a dead man, local outfitter Nate Fletcher. But it wasn't the explosion that killed Nate. It was 2 shots to the heart. The investigation is homing in on a suspect when the sheriff's department receives a 911 call from a man who says he's been shot. The man is barely able to give them his approximate location before the line goes dead. Maddie and Robo hurry to search for the wounded man, which leads us to the excerpt that I've selected to read to you tonight. In the dim light of dusk, she'd lost sight of Robo, and she stepped up her pace. She focused on dodging tree roots, deadfall rocks, and other barriers that seemed bent on catching her toe. She kept her eye on the ground with an occasional glance uphill to try to spot her dog. She hated to call him back and interrupt his drive to search, but she had begun to wonder if she should. As she broke free from some trees, she finally saw Robo up ahead, still near the creek. The sun had set and its black fur and tawny markings blended into the forest in the waning light. He was skirting the area, winding around a cluster of bushes when he stopped, sniffing the air. As Maddie neared, she could see his hackles rise. "What do you smell?" she murmured as she reached him. He was standing still, sniffing as if trying to sift through the air. She wished she possessed his special power and could help. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it?" Maddie squinted, peering through the forest, struggling to detect something in the shadows that her dog could smell, but she couldn't see. "What's out there?" Robo edged closer, hovering at her left heel, growling as he searched the area with his eyes as well as his nose. A chill ran down her spine and Maddie drew her clock from its holster She had no idea what they were facing, but she understood her partner's warning. The forest was still. All the normal evening sounds hushed. A low-pitched roar rumbled from somewhere uphill, a primordial sound that shook Maddie to her core. For a few seconds, she and Robo froze, and then he broke into a furious bark. Several rattling chuffs from uphill answered, followed by the long, drawn-out growl of an apex predator. The hair at the back of her neck stood at attention. What on earth was that? A bear? A cougar? Her first concern was for her dog. She sure as hell didn't want him trying to protect her by charging to attack. Robo, heel, stay. She backed up to a pine tree, taking shelter against its rough bark. Robo stayed with her, but continued to carry on, barking and snarling. The predator responded with a rattling growl that ended in a roar. Maddie strained to see through the feeble light of dusk. Nothing but trees. She grabbed her flashlight from her belt and directed its powerful beam uphill. Again, nothing. Robo hovered at her side, his front paws lifting from the ground with every ferocious bark. A downward glance told her where he was looking, and she shone her light in that direction. She glimpsed the shape of a large cat before it whirled and darted away. And I'll end it there, but I'll tell you, that wasn't a cougar.
Now you gave it away.
Well, hopefully people want to find out what it was.
I'm sure. Do we have any questions? If you have a question, type it in your chat, or if one of the other panelists has a question, unmute yourself and feel free to ask. I want to know if you've ever had any canine tracking experience. I mean, have you ever done that with your dogs? Or
Way back when I was in my 30s, my husband and I decided to go ahead and train a couple of our dogs in search and rescue. So we joined a group with Larimer County and had that experience of training these dogs on nose work. And I was able to see all of the different dogs and what they could do, those that tracked on the ground and those that scented through the air. Got to see lots of different dog behavior. And in training our two dogs, we got to see the difference between those two dogs as well. We used to have hide and seek games in our house, and the dog would go and find our children. So the whole family got to get involved.
I remember you're bringing up the woman who does the tracking in your area and having her do a drug. They planted like things that were 5 years old with residue of cocaine all over. And it was like, you would think it would be too old. And man, that dog had them within 60 seconds, every single one of them. It was amazing.
That was actually Kathleen Donnelly, who is a member of Rocky Mountain Mystery Writers of America. And she has a business, a private business called Sherlock Hounds. And there are a couple of different handlers, and they do drug narcotic detection, primarily in schools, and at different things like sports events and dances and things like that. So their mission is to keep our schools safe from drugs.
There are some questions that, well, someone says they receive a lot of requests for your book on audio. So when is it decided that a book will go from print to audio?
It depends upon the publisher and what those rights, the audio rights, are doing with that particular publisher. But my publisher is Crooked Lane Books in New York City, and they typically sell the audio rights. And at that point, the audio rights often the audio books often come out at the very same time as the print and the ebook version. So I love that, because I know a lot of people like to listen to the book as well as read it. And so it's wonderful. The narrator for my series so far, she works for Blackstone Audio, who has recorded all of the books. All 5 of the books are recorded. And she actually lives in Colorado. So I've been able to meet her, and it's been a great partnership.
Well, that's great. And then do you have a set number of books planned for the series, or are you just winging it?
I've been kind of winging it so far. I had hoped to have at least 6 books. We'll release the 6th book in September. It's called Hanging Falls. And then I did go ahead and get sign a contract for 2 more books. So I have been writing book 7 right now. Yeah, it's been great. And like Carter, I had planned to set that book in 2020. It's set in the month of October because I wanted to use the weather. Boy, you know, I just have no idea what October of 2020 is going to look like. So I'm having it be set in October of 2019. I think we'll have to all decide where we go from there, but we'll have to just wait and see what pans out. I do hope to have at least 8 books and maybe 9 in the series.
And as Donnell Ann Bell says in the chat, 2019 is going to be a very popular year.
Yes, it is.
Truly is true.
We'll have 2 years in one.
Right. So now I'm going to go ahead and move us forward and work into the thrillers. And then at the end, we'll let people ask of all of us. But so Donnell Ann Bell is going to read from her thriller novel, Black Pearl, a cold case suspense. Donnell began her writing career at the Colorado Springs Journal and Pikes Peak Parent News magazine before turning to fiction. An award-winning author, including a 2-time Golden Heart finalist, her books have been Amazon digital bestsellers. Donnell, you have to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Colorado Humanities and to Chris and to Tanya. And I'm just so honored to be in this group and just delighted to see everybody. Black Pearl is my first book of my first suspense. My books have been romantic suspense, and my publisher wanted a suspense this time, and I think maybe I pulled it off. Black Pearl is book 1 of a cold investigation team. The story begins when Lieutenant Everett T. Pope is called to an ancient hospital to be demolished the next morning. Patrol has reported that a murder has been sensationally staged, and during autopsy, a Tahitian pearl is found wedged under the victim's tongue. A black pearl has ties to a 14-year-old cold case in an FBI investigation in Montrose, Colorado. No way does Pope want the feds involved, but he has no choice but to call in a special agent who worked the case 14 years earlier. Supervisory Special Agent Brian DePietro requested not only a transfer, but a demotion upon his return to Denver. After the death of his wife, the last thing he wants to do is to supervise. With Pope determined to not have the feds involved and Brian anxious to no longer supervise, Black Pearl, a cold case suspense, is a prime example that we don't always get what we want. And I'm going to read the opening and a short entry to chapter 1, if that's okay. Waltham, Massachusetts, May 1996. He'd read that arsonists loved to return to the scene of the crime. He wouldn't know this was his first arson. Even so, the leaping orange flames and billowing smoke climbing from the 2nd floor of Veronica's stately colonial truly mesmerized him. He'd never known that fire sounded like an incoming tide or the roar of a turbulent ocean. From the balcony of a vacant property across from her estate, he could hear the collapse of beams, the pops of embers, and the frantic shouts of fire crews working to stamp out his handiwork. They could try. He itched to take credit, stand among the faces he knew on this pre-dawn morning, listen as neighbors raced into each other's arms and cried at the demise of such a beloved family. Later, perhaps, his resemblance to family presented a problem. He gripped his fist tighter. Who would have guessed that tonight the coward would stand up to the bitch, then change his mind and turn on him? He'd won the battle naturally, and the silly pacifist would likely survive. The question remained whether he'd walk again. Veronica hadn't made it out, he was certain. She'd missed tomorrow's board meeting, poor dear. Everybody knew she couldn't find her way out of a body bag. His success made him tremble with glee, and he relaxed his fist. The Tahitian pearls he'd ripped from her throat lay cool when he opened his palm. Her last moments alive had been drenched in outrage, while his had been steeped in righteous satisfaction to take something she valued over her own flesh and blood. The beauty of it all, no one would ever know what really happened unless he chose to reveal. Chapter 1, Pope, Denver, Colorado, 21 years later. Everett T. Pope hated anonymous tips. He really hated them at 2 a.m. If somebody gave him something for nothing, he could bet his sweet ass it came equipped with a minefield of booby traps. He stepped over more than a few over the course of his career. Whether you saw them or not, they lay in wait, ready to trip you up, then explode in your face. Or they segged into cops finding a body. He really hated that. He pulled to the curb of an abandoned property he'd driven past for years without blinking. St. Benedict's. On an average day, the abandoned hospital northeast of downtown Denver looked like a sad vision of urban decay. This morning, with blue and red light bars illuminating the pre-dawn skies, it looked like what it was, a crime scene.
Okay. Very good. So we have a question. How did you enjoy writing a straight suspense compared to romantic suspense?
I really feel that suspense is my gift. I love romance, but I think that so many authors do it much better. My first editor, when I wrote The Past Came Hunting, she had me take out all the sex scenes that my agent had made me sex up the book. So I was very comfortable when they said, we'd really like a straight suspense. Thanks.
And someone says, my husband works for DPT, so I will have to read this.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Anyone in the cast of characters here? I want to know how you researched a police department investigation like that. It's got to be kind of a police procedural with the characters that you have. So how did you do that? Because you didn't work in the police department, as far as I know, right?
I was a victims advocate for the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. And I've done a lot of citizens academies, and I've gone to the Writers Police Academy, and I own crime scene writers, which I was deliberate on my part. I wanted to learn police procedure. And so I've been very blessed to meet lots of police officers, either online or on the phone or in person. So I do my research.
Because it really rings true.
Thank you.
And Allie asks, is it anything like CSI?
No, because my crime scene writers would get so mad at me if I compared anything to CSI. No. That's fictional and that's television. I tried to make it at least a little bit authentic.
And how did you research the psychology of an arsonist?
Well, the book isn't about an arsonist. So I do know a little bit about arson. The protagonist is not, or the antagonist is not necessarily an arson. I will say that much.
Okay. Yeah. Well, very good. We'll come back to all this. Thank you so much, Donnell. The next reader, Carter Wilson, will read from his thriller novel, The Dead Girl in 2A. A best-selling author of 6 critically acclaimed standalone psychological thrillers, as well as numerous short stories, and a 3-time winner of the Colorado Book Award, his novels have received multiple starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Library Journal. Carter?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for hosting this, and thank you to Colorado Humanities for their excellent support and organization in these weird times. Yes, I'm going to read a little bit from The Dead Girl in 2A, and just as a point of reference, I don't outline. I've never been able to outline, so I never know what I'm going to write about. I always think of an opening scene that just is something that I would want to read or maybe see in a TV show as an opening. And I started writing this opening scene, and essentially it was a man and woman sitting next to each other on a plane in first class, seats 2A and 2B. And they each have this like visceral sense of knowing the other person, you know, to the point where like even their smell is familiar. And I just kind of imagine like, well, what would that conversation sound like? What would they ask each other? So I just wrote this scene out, and the conversation was, you know, the flight from Boston to Denver, trying to figure out how do we know each other, and they couldn't figure out anything, but they had a few peculiar things in common. One, they were both realized they had both been orphaned as children. 2, neither of them had any memories of their past prior to the age of 9. And the last thing they had in common is they each had a copy of an exceedingly creepy children's book that were different. Their copies were different, but they were each called The Responsibility of Death. And as this flight is landing, the woman confesses to the man that she's actually going to the Colorado mountains to kill herself. And so that sets off. So the whole book is about what happens after they get off that plane. And so I just wrote all this weird stuff and tried to figure out how it all connected, which is kind of the whole enjoyment of writing to me, is trying to figure out that puzzle of that scene, not knowing how any of that made any sense at all. So the whole story is from the man's perspective, and then alternating from the woman's perspective. And then her perspective are her journal entries, which are basically documenting her life. It's a long suicide note. So what I'm going to read very briefly tonight is actually her description of the children's book, her copy of this really creepy children's book called The Responsibility of Death. The Responsibility of Death is a children's book. There is no author name, copyright information, publisher, or ISBN. Nothing but the title. The story centers on a young boy's long walk through a forest with his grandfather. During their walk, they encounter many creatures, all of which have advice for the two of them. But each time a creature speaks, the boy and the grandfather hear different things. A squirrel chitters, and the boy hears, "Sleep heavily each night," while the grandfather hears, "There's only darkness." It's nonsensical and disturbing, with the boy hearing only encouraging words, and the old man hearing morbid advice, culminating with an old grizzly bear suggesting to the grandfather he might be best served by killing himself. Accompanying the words are wondrous illustrations, all done in fine black hair-width pen strokes, thousands upon thousands of inky wisps, collectively bringing to life the bizarre tale in the most depressing fashion. I think about how long those illustrations must have taken, how long this illustrator sat at a desk, hunched over paper, meticulously drawing one ink whisper at a time, trying to capture a scene of a snake telling the grandfather everyone is out to get him, all while trees tower and loom, raining darkness. Each drawing is a piece of art, but one that somehow feels it shouldn't be seen by anyone, mesmerizing and unnerving. The story's simplicity is also why it's so disturbing. That and the ending. On the penultimate page, the grandfather speaks for the first time. He looks down at his wide-eyed grandson and says, "I'll never come out of these woods, boy." The final page, formatted so that it requires the reader to turn the book 90 degrees, shows the boy walking back on the path from whence they traveled, and the grandfather remaining behind. The old man sits stoop-shouldered on top of a tree stump, and in the background loom the eyes of animals, malevolent, glowing stars, watching and waiting. I suppose the end is up for interpretation, but not much. Either the old man was dying and chose to let it happen in the woods, or he wanted to die and was sacrificing himself to the waiting teeth and claws of all that lived there. I have read The Responsibility of Death enough times to recall many of the thousands of inked marks with precise clarity, but still have no idea what the book is about. What responsibility is the author talking about? The best I can come up with is that the idea that once a person's time on earth is coming to an end, there's a responsibility to acknowledge that and to perhaps do something to hasten the process, making way for the younger generation, yielding land and resources to those who need them more. So that's all I'm going to read, but I will say that I wanted to see what this book looked like. And so I hired an illustrator in New York, and I gave her the passage that I just read. And I said, draw me that final page. And so she drew me, it's kind of hard to see. You can see the boy walking from the stoop, and it's made out of thousands and thousands of individual little ink marks that the publisher let me put into the book. Because that was just important for me to see, because really there's a science to what this is all supposed to represent, not only in terms of the story, but the visual aspects and what it does to the reader. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Wow. Are there any questions? Is there a particular creepy children's book that inspired this idea?
No, it all came from my stupid brain. Like it just popped in there like that would be a creepy thing to write about. And as I started writing it, and there's various characters who all, and every copy is totally different story. Same illustrator, completely different story. And I had so much fun imagining what kind of stories would just be kind of kid's book, but also like deeply, deeply unnerving at the same time.
I remember hearing that you actually, when you were working on this, were on a plane sitting next to a woman who was sitting in 2A. Is that?
Yeah, actually, I had already sold the book to the publisher, and I got upgraded to first class, which almost never happens to me. And I sat next to a 23-year-old girl who was in seat 2A, and I tried to figure out how I was going to broach the subject, but I knew I had to bring up this story. And so I started talking to her like, hey, I know this sounds really weird. It's okay. It's okay. But I told her the whole story. And then her first question was, what's this girl's name? And I told her that the name was Claire. She's like, oh, thank God, because that wasn't her name, because she was actually headed to the Colorado mountains, but for a family reunion. So it was very, very strange.
So Donnell wants to know how long it took you to write this book.
This was probably the hardest book I've ever written, because I wrote myself into a complete corner. And again, since I don't outline, I had zero idea where it was going. So about halfway through, I took a month off and just kind of, literally wrote words on a wall to see if I could figure out where it was headed. So it took me all in all almost a year to do this book. I tried to do a book a year, but this one took a little bit longer than most.
And Dirk wants to know, you guys could ask these questions. Writing without an outline sounds frightening. Do you have an ending in mind, or do you literally let the story write itself?
I literally let this, because I don't know. I've tried to outline. It's not how my brain works. And then I've realized that figuring it out as I go along is the most exciting part to me, because I'll be 80% into the book and realize like, oh, this is what this book is about. It's about, saving your family or whatever. And usually the ending comes to me probably between the 80 and 90% completion factor. So, and that's so exciting when that, I have to go rewrite everything, of course, but that's exciting when that happens.
And Emily, you wanted to know, you share a love of Stephen King. Do you have a favorite title of his?
The unabridged version of The Stand. That's just, that's the one book I'll go back and reread, and it's just phenomenal.
All right. All right. Well, we're going to move on to Michael Laurence. And Michael is going to read from his thriller novel, The Extinction Agenda. Born in Colorado Springs to an engineer and a teacher who kindled his passions for science and history, he studied biology and creative writing at the University of Colorado. Before becoming a full-time author, he worked as an X-ray, CTI, MRI technologist, and clinical instructor. He lives in suburban Denver with his wife and 4 children. Michael?
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone who put this program together tonight. Everything's great. Really appreciate it. And congratulations to all the other finalists and good luck to you. Extinction Agenda is the first book in a new series from St. Martin's Press.
Hold it up longer.
We followed in August by The Annihilation Protocol. The Extinction Agenda is the story of Special Agent James Mason, who stumbles upon a plot to release a deadly virus, one perpetrated by a sinister mass murderer who's been photographed at the epicenter of seemingly every historical pandemic without appearing to age. He's a really nasty guy who tries to derail Mason's investigation by killing his wife. Aided by his friends Gunnar and Ramses, Mason's hunt for his wife's killer leads him to a dark union at the dawn of the 20th century and a network of Nazi collaborators that leads him to a conspiracy more than 100 years in the making. Now, after 2 decades writing sci-fi horror as Michael McBride, I wanted to take a stab at writing a traditional thriller, one that I felt really touched on a lot of the strange things going on in the world today, and one that took place here in Colorado. For those of you who've been around for a while, you'll probably recognize a lot of the locations in the book. The scene I'd like to read tonight, Mason and his strike force have tracked the organization responsible for trafficking the virus to an abandoned stone quarry, where they find out that they've been set up. Now, with the majority of his team dead, the building on fire around him, and his partner, Special Agent Spencer Kane, taken hostage, Mason faces down his nemesis, the man with the blue eyes, for the first time. A man appeared in the aisle about 20 feet ahead of him, as though he'd simply materialized from the first plumes of smoke that drifted between them. "Hands behind your head," Mason shouted. The man cocked his head first one way and then the other, in a manner reminiscent of a predatory bird. He wore a full respirator mask over his face and a wide-brimmed Panama hat. The hint of a tie and a black suit coat were visible above the top of a gray butcher's apron smeared with bloody handprints. His black leather shoes shined with the advancing flames. "Down on your knees, hands behind your head." The man tipped up his chin as though to better appraise Mason. His irises were a startling shade of blue outside of nature's traditional palette. He had no brows, and the skin around his eyes and on his forehead was pink and welted. Maybe that was just the reflection on his face shield of the flames eating through the plastic walls. Mason sighted the dot from his laser right between the man's eyes. The man with the blue eyes wagged his index finger at Mason and then pointed to the stall to his right. Kane stepped out from behind the wall, the slender barrel of an automatic rifle pressed to the soft spot behind his jaw and under his ear. Mason could barely see the crown of his captor's head over Kane's left shoulder. Kane shrugged, as though to let him know that things might not have been going as planned, but that he still had everything under control. Mason kept his laser pinned to the man's forehead, below the brim of his hat. More smoke drifted between them, momentarily concealing him. When he appeared again, there was a cell phone in his hand. His eyes narrowed. At first, it looked like he was wincing, but then it hit Mason. He was smiling beneath the mask. "Shoot him," Kane said through the comlink in Mason's ear. "You do it and we're all dead," a deep voice shouted from behind his partner. Mason could easily neutralize the man in the mask at this range, but even he might not be fast enough to get off another shot before the second man put a bullet through Kane's head. If he took care of the more immediate threat to his partner, the man with the blue eyes would still be standing out in the open with nowhere to hide. "Shoot him, Mason. This whole place is wired. Take the shot, damn it." Mason swung his rifle toward the man trying to use Kane as a human shield, pulled the trigger, watched the top of the man's head vanish as he looked over his partner's shoulder. Kane stumbled forward and the rifle fell away from his head. Mason's laser sight sliced through the smoke like a scythe. He was already firing before it reached the man with the blue eyes, who stumbled backward when the first bullet took him high in the shoulder. A ribbon of blood unspooled behind him. He pressed his thumb to the screen of his cell phone. Mason saw his eyes, his ultramarine eyes. The reflection of a ball of fire blossomed inside him. Then the world became light and pain.
I have to ask the question, the elephant in the room here. We all know that this book has been in the can a long time, but a pandemic, do you get people
Perfect timing.
talking to you?
And it comes out in paperback next month. So yeah, perfect timing.
Perfect timing. It's so prophetic. I was thinking about it because I heard Dean Koontz had written in a 1999 novel about a virus that wipes out the world in 2020, and it's actually in print from 1999.
The coronavirus in Wuhan.
Like, prophetic.
Yep.
Donnell wants to know, how did you research for this and the virology of it?
I collect a very extensive library of textbooks and everything I can possibly find to read and research. Spend hours and hours online, printing it out, putting it in binders, and just collecting every last piece of information I can get my hands on, and then asking people if I don't know the answers.
What made you think of writing about a pandemic?
That was just the story that took form, unfortunately. I wish I had a good answer for it. There's a lot of funky stuff going on out there with viruses that may or may not be man-made and may or may not be designed to be released as weapons. And this is kind of delving into it just a little bit.
And you said you decided you wanted to try your hand at a thriller. What made you decide to switch genres after so many books?
I wanted to write the book. As you're writing from one book to the next, you start picking up lots of bits of information, a little bit here, a little bit there. And the next thing you know, you've got a fully formed idea sitting in the back of your head. And time had just come to work on it.
And it fit the thriller.
Fit the
thriller. Okay, well, does anyone else have any questions? We can open it up to questions. How did your working titles compare with the published titles? To all the panelists, how do your working titles compare with your published titles?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll say my original working title for this book was The Orphan List, which I loved, but then they shop it around at the publisher and they decided that it had too much historical connotation. So it was actually the publisher who came up with Dead Girl in 2A. So it's always that back and forth, usually, is my experience at least.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just second what Carter said. Some of the titles I've suggested have sailed right through, no issue. At other times, it hits a roadblock and it seems to come to a consensus. And I know the publisher has a little back room where they run it through the staff there, and I think everybody votes on different titles, and they say, okay, you try to get a consensus on one or another, and that's happened a time or two as well.
Margaret?
When we started this series, my editor at that time thought that it would be great if we started the titles with gerundive phrases. So we have Killing Trail, Stalking Ground, Hunting Hour, Burning Ridge, and Tracking Game.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's getting progressively hard to come up with titles in that particular form. So with Tracking Game, I had some crazy title that doesn't even deserve to be stated in public. And when I sent it in, I said, well, as always, I'm not married to this title. Let's just figure out, maybe we can brainstorm it, which we had done on the other titles. But this time the publishing team kind of seemed to want me to come up with it. So I must have submitted 20, 30 titles, and Terry Wolf is my agent. She helped me. We came up with all kinds of titles. And finally, one of the ones we submitted was Tracking Game. And the publishing team loved it because there's quite a bit of tracking in this book. And it can kind of be used not only as a gerundive, tracking game, but also as a verb in tracking game, because that actually happens later in the book.
Wow. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think my publishers have denied 5 of my last 6 titles. Either marketing hates it, the editor hates it. You just smile and nod and go with whatever they want you to go with.
Mhm.
Well, I'll tell you my story. I had a title that was all picked out, and then my editor came back with Black Pearl. And I said, Johnny Depp is not even in this book. There's not a pirate ship around. But she said, no, but if we put cold case suspense with it. And I have to say, because of the Tahitian Pearls, it's a perfect title, in my opinion.
There's another question here, and someone wants to know if you guys write, do you have a certain number of words per day goal that you do, or pages per day, or what's your work schedule, sort of, I guess?
I shoot for 1,000 words a day, 5 days a week. And there are days, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, that I just couldn't even come close to that goal. So I decided, okay, 5,000 words a week, and try to make it so that you're not writing 7 days a week. Try to make it so that you at least have 1 day off. And so that's kind of what I stick to.
Yeah, my goal is 500 words a day, but I do try to do 7 days a week because that's my escape every day. Is I get to go into that world of not knowing what's going to happen next. So to me, that's like where I get to go and hide from everything.
Anyone else wanna?
I do 3 handwritten pages like this every day. Works out to about 1,500 to 2,000 words a day.
So do you, at the end of this, take your notebook and transcribe it, or do you do transcribe in the morning and then?
Write in the morning, transcribe in the afternoon. First pass edit. It's terribly complicated.
Oh, she does it too. Look at.
I don't know how many words I have. I'm sorry. I write in Greg shorthand, and then I print it out.
Very cool.
So there's another, oh my gosh, she does it. Handwriting. How, Carter and Emily, do you handwrite? Margaret,
Oh God, that sounds awful. That's a psychopath.
I'm with Carter. Yes, no way.
Well, that's half and half. Interesting.
I think it exercises a part of your brain. I kind of like, we talked about this in book club about cursive, that you're actually using a part of your brain. No offense, Carter, but if you can think that way and you're that quick on your feet, that's great. But the shorthand and the printing makes me.
I can tell you, I have kids that are dyslexic, and one of the things they do is not the cursive is not a big thing, but they do teach them things like they have them crawl because it helps cross the brain. So anything like that I could see that would make connections. There's a question. I have always, oh, wait a minute. No. Somebody is writing. Oh, Emily, I see your strong spirit, and Gemma, somebody is writing to Emily. And then Mary Ellen Tripp is writing. And so that's nice. That's nice. That was a personal thing. I thought there was a question there, but no. Anyone else have a question? Oh. Josephine, you're muted. We have to unmute you. Where are you? I'll unmute you. Oh, there you go.
From the Facebook feed, for the series writers, how do you keep track of your characters from book to book?
And then start with an answer to that. Yeah.
Okay, Emily.
Yeah, my books take place just a couple months apart from one another. So I try to do seasonal, winter, spring, summer, fall. So things like spreadsheets, notes. I've tried to do a bulletin board with index cards on it before. That's worked. And having their books happen so close to one another, it's easier to keep track of.
I keep a I keep a ring binder with all of my characters and their descriptions, and it's getting thicker and thicker as the series goes on. I also try to keep a list of character names. I'm particularly interested in names that have kind of a Western sound to them. So I keep a list of character names too, because coming up with character names is really hard for me while I'm writing. So that list is just kind of ongoing.
Do you ever run into the problem of finding that you've like named all your characters with a J name that starts with a J or something, and then you have to go back and rethink all of that?
One of my biggest regrets in the series is that in book 1, I named the dog Robo, and he was actually named after a real dog who was the partner of one of my consultants. And then I named, for some unknown reason, one of Maddie's friends Rainbow. And so as the series has gone on, I have to be so careful when I have Rainbow and Robo in the same paragraph. And so that's probably the worst thing that's happened. And yes, I do sometimes realize I'm picking a letter and I have to go back and rename characters.
I'll second that because I just did that about a week and a half ago on the book I'm working on right now. The letter M is what killed me. I had a couple of ships that started with the letter M and a couple of characters with M names. And you start reading through it and it's like, okay, yeah, you're fumbling over the same letter all the time. You have to go back and fix it.
Anything else? We have a couple of thank you very much for sharing. How or when do you develop your characters for everybody? Do you like start with a character? Do you start with a setting, a setup? Do you start with, when do you develop them?
Oh, just going back to the idea of being a pantser, when I write that first scene, I don't know anything about the characters. I just like, here's this person, here's that person, like very, very vague idea of what they might even look like. And then that's the best part of writing, is spending the whole book trying to develop their character and figuring out who they are and learning about them. So it's just this total lengthy process that changes day by day for me.
Now, everybody who has a series character, you're locked into certain things. I mean, I write a series character with my bird watchings. And I mean, there are times that I want her to do something, or I want Raisa to do something in my thrillers, and there's no way she would do it. And so you get stuck. How do you deal with that in a character? You can't make them do something that they're not supposed to.
Repeat the question, Chris.
Well, if you have a character that's a series character, there's certain things ingrained in their character. They're just certain things they wouldn't do. They would never do it. But for the purposes of your plot, you really kind of need the character to do something. How do you deal with that? You can write yourself into a corner.
Well, there's a old saying, make your character suffer. You put them in a position that they would never, ever do something. For instance, somebody's afraid of heights and you send them up to a cliff, or you, that's a way to make your character suffer. Is what we always say in critique groups. So
yeah, that's true. Margaret?
I think that I have been in that position before, Chris. I know what you're talking about. And I think that what I've tried to do is present in that particular scene the reason why my character is acting differently than she usually does. So I have to figure out what her motivation is for acting that way. And if you can develop that aspect of the scene, I think that really helps make it work.
I did have a thought. Could I say something about characters? I did a ride along with a Colorado Springs police officer, field training officer, when I wrote this book. And one of the things we brainstormed, my female, she's a FTO, field training officer. And she said to me, so many of the books that she reads make their female protagonists sluts. They sleep, they drink a lot. And she said, a person in a FTO position does not get where they are by being stupid, loose, taking risks. They're career oriented. And that made all the difference to me when I wrote this character. So I kind of got inside her head just because I knew what the FTO said. Thanks.
So I have one more question for everybody and then maybe we'll wrap. But have you ever scared yourself when you're writing? I mean, have you ever like all of a sudden been sitting at your desk and thought, oh, yeah, you
Yeah,
have?
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Many times where I'll write a scene, and as I'm actually writing it, I kind of start like feeling the sense like, am I really alone right now? Is there nobody behind me? Yeah, absolutely.
That means you're doing it right.
Right. That's half the fun.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone, and I'll turn it over to Josephine to take us home.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris, for this in your own mysterious and thrilling writing.
Thank you.
And thanks to those of you who joined us for staying in and logging on. We'd love to hear what you thought about tonight's program in the chat or an email or however you'd like to get a message to us. Suggestions are welcome anytime about what we might do for authors. This is a strange time, isn't it? Again, thanks to Outskirts and Colorado Sun. And if you do reach out to them for services or support, let them know you're there because they support the Colorado Center for the Book. And please support local businesses by ordering books from the Book Bar and other local bookstores. Our next finalist readings will be romance and science fiction, fantasy fiction on May 1. I always wanted to link these two because romance and science fiction. And then next there's children the next day, May 2nd at 1 p.m. So it'll be a great time to gather the grandkids around the monitor, right?
We're actually going to have the illustrators. Some of them are coming and they are going to be doing demonstrations of how they draw for the children's books. So it's pretty exciting.
Very cool.
So I will now vaguely say winners will be announced later this spring. Stay tuned to our website and social media. And do opt into our newsletter at the bottom of any webpage, at ColoradoHumanities.org webpage for readings and celebration updates. Stay well, and thank you so much